My
I've
name is
always
Martha Johnson,
believed
and
that
I'm
the
73
small
years old
moments,
now,
the
long
quiet
past the
ones,
age where you pretend
are what
life went the way
truly
you
make
hoped it
up a
would.
life.
What I'm about to tell you, well, people always say you never truly know what happens behind someone else's front door. I suppose my story proves that. I grew up in Millfield, a small southern town where everybody waved on the street, where gossip traveled faster than the mail, and where you could walk into the grocery store and know every face in the aisle. My childhood was simple. Daddy worked at the paper mill. Mama taught Sunday school and kept our home warm and spotless even when times were hard. We weren't wealthy, but we were steady, the kind of family people pointed to and said, "They're good folks." I believed the world was kind and predictable back then. I believed if you did everything right, life would reward you with the same. Then I met Bill. It was the 4th of July church picnic, summer of 1956. I was 18, wearing a blue sundress Mama had sewn, and I felt pretty for the first time in my life. Bill was 23, just home from Korea. Handsome, confident, with slicked back hair and a smile that made people turn their heads. When he walked over and asked me to dance, my heart fluttered like a trapped bird. I remember thinking he looked like James Dean if James Dean had manners. "You're the prettiest girl here," he told me. I laughed, embarrassed, but he said it so sincerely that I believed it. Maybe that was the first moment he had power over me before either of us knew he would use it the way he eventually did. Bill courted me the right way, brought Mama flowers, shook Daddy's hand with respect, took me to the movies every Saturday night. Everyone whispered about what a catch he was. Daddy liked him instantly, said he was a hard worker with a bright future. And when Bill proposed 6 months later, nobody questioned it, not even me. We married at First Baptist Church. I wore Mama's wedding dress, the same lace veil my grandmother had worn. In our wedding photo, the one that sat on our mantle for 45 years, Bill is looking at me like I'm the center of the whole world. For a long time, I kept that photo as proof that once, in the beginning, he really did love me. Or maybe I kept it as proof that I wasn't foolish to marry him. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. The first 2 years were as close to perfect as any young bride could imagine. We bought a little white house on Elm Street with a picket fence and a porch swing where we sat every evening dreaming about the future. Bill would bring me wildflowers he picked on the way home from the Harrison factory. I cooked dinner every night. He'd brag about my pot roast to anyone who'd listen. We talked about children 3, maybe 4. Back then, everything felt possible. When I got pregnant with Jimmy, our first child, Bill painted the nursery himself, blue walls, tiny hand-painted boats trimming the border. He built a crib from scratch, sanding every rail until it was smooth as glass. Everyone said I was the luckiest girl in town. Jimmy was born in the spring of 1959. Beautiful baby boy with Bill's eyes and my nose. Bill cried when he held him, passed out cigars at the hospital, told every nurse that his boy weighed 8 pounds, 7 ounces, as if he'd carved him out of wood himself. He kissed my forehead and whispered, "You did real good, Martha." I almost believed the fairy tale ending was real, but fairy tales never warn you how quickly a happy life can turn. The night Jimmy came home, Bill went out for drinks with the men from the factory. "Just celebrating," he said. He came back late, stumbling, reeking of whiskey. Jimmy had been crying for hours, and I was exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. "Can't you shut that kid up?" Bill snapped. The words stung, but I told myself it was just the alcohol. I said, "He's just hungry again, Bill. Babies cry. Well, make him stop." His tone was sharp, sharper than I'd ever heard it. I took Jimmy to the nursery to feed him, and when I came back, Bill was snoring, the anger gone like it had never existed. Mama always said new fathers get overwhelmed. Men don't always know what to do with babies. I clung to that explanation. The next day, he kissed me tenderly and apologized. He brought home flowers, white daisies, said he'd been stressed, tired from work, didn't mean a word of it. I wanted to believe him. I did believe him. 2 days later, I made pot roast, his favorite. Jimmy was colicky, had cried all afternoon. By dinner time, my hands were shaking from exhaustion. The pot roast was a little dry. "What's this?" Bill said, pushing the plate away. "I work all day and come home to this?" "I'm sorry," I whispered. "Jimmy's been fussy. I can make you something else." "Damn it, Martha." He slammed his hand on the table so hard the dishes rattled. Jimmy cried harder from his bassinet. I moved to pick him up. That's when it happened. Bill grabbed my arm hard, spun me around. "Leave him," he growled. "He needs to learn. He's just a baby." "Bill." The slap came without warning. The sound echoed in our tiny kitchen like a gunshot. My cheek burned. I tasted blood where my teeth cut my lip. For a moment, he looked shocked like he hadn't meant to do it. Then his expression hardened. "Now look what you made me do," Jimmy screamed. I stood frozen, palm on my cheek, tears gathering but not falling. "Heat this up," he said, pointing at the pot roast. "And shut that kid up." I obeyed. My hands shook as I reheated his dinner. I rocked Jimmy until his cries softened. Bill ate in silence, then went to bed early. Later that night, he came to me with an ice pack, whispered apologies, promised it would never happen again, told me he was stressed about layoffs, had drunk too much, didn't know what came over him. "I love you, Martha," he murmured. "You know I'd never hurt you." "Not really." I told myself it was just once, just this one time. But that first slap, the one I excused, forgave, covered up, was only the beginning, and I was wrong for the next 30 years. For a little while after that first slap, things went back to looking normal from the outside. Bill was on his best behavior flowers on Fridays, helping with the baby, kissing my forehead like he used to. Sometimes I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, if maybe tiredness and stress had twisted a small moment into something bigger in my mind. But the truth is, people don't change because they feel bad for a day. They change when something forces them to. And nothing in Bill's world forced him to. Life kept moving. Our daughter, Carol, was born 2 years later, a tiny thing with blonde curls and bright eyes. Bill was thrilled to have his complete family, a boy and a girl, the picture-perfect household he wanted the world to see. But behind the curtains, the cracks grew. I was exhausted all the time, 2 children under 3, a house to keep running, no help, no breaks. Bill wanted dinner hot at exactly 6, wanted his shirts ironed crisp, wanted the house to look like a magazine, even though 2 toddlers were destroying it behind me. His temper came in gusts, short, sharp, and always my fault. One misplaced shirt meant a tight grip around my arm. A late dinner meant dishes slammed into the sink. A crying child during his favorite TV show meant him shouting until the whole house froze. Each time, he'd come with roses afterward, red roses, the same color as the marks on my skin. By the time Tommy was born in 1964, I already knew the pattern so well I could predict it like the weather. Calm skies meant a storm was coming. A storm meant a quiet, tearful apology afterward, like clockwork. I learned to hide the bruises, long sleeves in July, scarves even inside the house, makeup layered so carefully that the mirror felt like an accomplice. But hiding didn't matter because people didn't want to see the truth anyway. One Sunday, Pastor Roberts pulled me aside after service. I'd worn sunglasses to hide a swollen eye and claimed the sun was bothering me. "Martha," he said gently, "is everything all right at home?" My heart leaped. Maybe, just maybe, someone was finally seeing me. "Bill and we've been having some difficulties," I whispered. He nodded, solemn. Then he said the words that still echo in my head decades later. "Marriage is hard work. The good book says wives should submit to their husbands. Pray for patience. Pray for patience. Not safety. Not protection. Not justice. Just patience." I learned that the church wouldn't help me. Some months later, Bill shoved me so hard against the hallway wall that my wrist bent under me, snapping like a twig. At the doctor's office, Dr. Hopkins looked at the X-ray, then at me. "These stairs again?" he asked softly. I couldn't answer. Tears welled up, spilling onto my cheeks before I could stop them. He sighed. "Martha, whatever is happening at home, it's not my place to interfere in a man's family. But be more careful, more careful." I learned that the doctors wouldn't help me either. At a family dinner, I watched Bill's father backhand his wife for spilling gravy on the tablecloth. She didn't flinch, didn't cry, just wiped the table with trembling hands. Everyone else kept eating like nothing happened. In that moment, something clicked inside me. Bill didn't become who he was overnight. He learned it. Violence passed down like a family recipe. Still, I tried to reach out to someone, my sister Janet. I called her one afternoon while the kids were at school. My lip split from the night before. "Bill hit me," I whispered, "because I used the wrong detergent." There was a pause. Then she said, "Well, you must have done something to make him mad. Bill's always so polite at family gatherings." I learned that even my own family wouldn't understand. As the kids grew older, they developed instincts no child should ever need. They learned the creaky floorboards to avoid when Bill was in a mood. Learned to be quiet. Learned to disappear. Jimmy, when he was 14, tried to stand between us once. Tried to protect me. Bill hit him so hard, the cut above his eye needed 7 stitches. On the way to the hospital, Bill said, "We'll tell them you fell off your bike. Right, Jimmy?" Jimmy nodded, blood dripping down his face, lip trembling. The emergency nurse smiled politely at Bill's charming small talk. The world always believed him. I thought about leaving. 1,000 times, maybe 10,000. But fear is a cage that locks from the inside. I had no job, no education, no money of my own. Bill controlled the bank account. There were no shelters back then, no hotline numbers printed inside bathroom stalls, no officers trained to intervene. And Bill made it perfectly clear, "You're mine, Martha, till death do us part. You try to leave me, I swear I'll find you." And I believed him. For 30 years, I believed him. Until the day something changed. Daddy died in 1975. The little life insurance money he left Mama went to me $10,000. Not a fortune, but more money than I'd ever held in my own hands. For a brief, trembling moment, I felt something like independence, like hope. Bill stretched out his hand. "I'll keep it safe for us." I hesitated. Just a moment. Just enough for him to see doubt in my eyes. That night, he beat me worse than he ever had. I felt ribs crack, my shoulder dislocate, my face swell until I could barely see. The next morning, I signed the check over to him. A week later, he gambled it all away at the track. "I was trying to double it," he sobbed, "to make a better life for us." I lay in bed that night, my body screaming with pain, and something inside me broke, not like a bone, more like a promise. Something died quietly in me, and something else was born. A memory surfaced so sharp it felt like someone whispering in my ear. My grandmother's hands, her herb garden, her low voice telling me, "Some plants protect women, child, when no one else will." I remembered the little jar of brownish powder she'd shown me at 12 years old, the recipe tucked into her notebook: valerian root, chamomile, skullcap, a mixture that could make a grown man sleep like the dead for hours. I hadn't understood then. I understood now. The next morning, as Bill left for work, I climbed into the attic, found the old trunk Mama had given me, found Granny May's notebook, her handwriting elegant and steady. Page 43. The recipe. My heart pounded so loudly, I thought it would shake dust from the rafters. Was I really considering this? My ribs throbbed their answer. Yes. For the first time in 3 decades, I had a seed of resistance in my hands. Small, fragile, dangerous. Exactly what I needed. Once that idea rooted itself inside me, quiet, terrifying, steady, it didn't leave. For the first time in years, I felt something close to clarity. Not courage, not yet. Just direction, a path, a possibility. But having a possibility and acting on it are 2 different things. I knew I needed the ingredients. Granny May's notebook listed everything carefully. Valerian root, chamomile, skullcap, 2 herbs whose names I could barely pronounce, and a final ingredient she only described as the veil, the one meant to hide the bitter taste. I couldn't buy these things in Millfield. If anyone saw me asking questions, the gossip alone would lead straight back to Bill. So I lied. "Bill," I said over breakfast one Tuesday, "a lady from church invited me to her gardening class in the next town over. Thought I'd learn something." He grunted without looking up. "Don't be long. Dinner better be on time." I nodded, hiding how my heart fluttered fear mixed with determination. I drove to a small health food store in the neighboring town, a place I'd never been before, run by a woman with long gray braids and sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through you. "Looking for something specific?" she asked, seeing me hover too long over the rows of jars filled with dried leaves and roots. "Just interested in natural remedies," I said, casually, like a woman who wanted to try lavender tea for better sleep. "My grandmother used to make her own. I'm trying to remember what she taught me." She nodded knowingly. "Smart woman, your grandmother. The old ways work." I picked out only the herbs I recognized: valerian, chamomile, skullcap, pretending to compare prices so she wouldn't notice my shaking hands. When she rang them up, she said, "You know, valerian's strong. Good for men who don't like to stay asleep." I froze. She looked right at me. I managed a small smile. My husband snores, don't they all? She said, handing me my bag. I hid the herbs in an old coffee can under Bill's fishing tackle, a place he'd never look. Fishing was his business, and sewing was women's work, and our marriage worked on the unspoken rule that he never crossed into my territory, and I never crossed into his. The next day, I went to the library, checked out 3 books on herbal medicine. The librarian smiled politely as she stamped the cards. Interest in natural remedies is growing, she said. My mother swore by chamomile. My grandmother too, I replied. That part wasn't a lie. Back home, I read every page of those books. I wasn't trying to harm Bill permanently. I wasn't plotting murder. I wasn't even sure I believed I could go through with it. But I needed to know what I was doing. Needed to know that all I wanted was time, a few hours where Bill couldn't hurt me, couldn't stop me, couldn't stand in the doorway like a wall blocking my future. The final ingredient, the veil, wasn't something I could find at any store. So I made a phone call I'd been afraid to make for years. Aunt Judith, my mother's cousin, a woman who had learned the old ways from Granny May herself, lived 3 hours away in the mountains and hadn't heard from me in a decade. When she picked up the phone, her voice cracked with age but carried the same stern warmth I remembered. Martha, is that really you? It's been years, child. I know, Aunt Judith. I'm sorry. Life's been busy. A pause. Married life keeping you occupied? My throat tightened. Something like that. How's your husband? I swallowed. Fine. The kind of sound that says she didn't believe me even for a second. I forced myself onward. Aunt Judith, I was going through some of Granny May's old things, her recipe book. I wondered if you might still have her special tea blend, the one for sleeping trouble. There was a silence, a long, heavy silence. Then she said, very softly, sleeping trouble or sleeping husband trouble? My heart pounded, as if she'd reached into my chest. I don't know what you mean, I whispered. Another pause. Then, come see me Saturday. Tell him your aunt is sick. I'll have what you need. On Saturday morning, I told Bill I had to visit Aunt Judith because she wasn't feeling well. Since when do you care? He said suspiciously. I kept my face neutral. She's family, and she asked for me. He snorted. Be back by dinner. I drove 3 hours through winding mountain roads, praying Bill didn't decide to follow me. When I pulled up to Aunt Judith's house, she was already waiting on the porch. She took one look at me, really looked at me, and saw everything. The fading bruises, the way I held my ribs, the way my eyes darted to the driveway, expecting Bill's truck. She didn't ask questions, just wrapped her arms around me, careful not to hurt me. Inside her kitchen, she made tea. I sat at the old wooden table, the one I'd sat at as a child, and the familiar smell of herbs nearly brought me to tears. When she finally asked, "Is it bad, Martha?" Something inside me crumbled. For the first time in 30 years, I told the truth out loud. Not all of it, but enough. The first slap, the broken bones, the threats, the fear that had become my shadow. She didn't gasp, didn't judge, didn't say, "Why didn't you leave?" Or "What did you do to make him mad?" She just listened, and when I finished, trembling and empty, she stood up and walked to a cedar cabinet. "Granny May helped your grandmother once," she said, taking out a small cloth pouch. "Now I'm helping you." She placed it in my hand. "This is the veil. Masks the bitterness. But be careful, too little, and he'll taste it. Too much." She didn't finish the sentence. "I don't want to kill him," I said quickly. "I know that, child. This isn't about death. It's about time. About escape." Before I left, she pressed a small key into my palm. "Safety deposit box. First National Bank in Asheville. Box 217. There's $500 inside. Been waiting for the woman in the family who needed it most. Looks like that's you." I hugged her despite the pain in my ribs. "Thank you," I whispered. Driving home, that small pouch in my purse, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was 18 in a blue sundress. Hope. But hope can be dangerous. It makes you see possibilities, makes you remember who you were before fear hollowed you out. Back home, I hid everything carefully. The herbs inside a Band-Aid tin in my sewing basket. The notebook inside my Bible. Then I spent the next few weeks mixing the powder in stolen moments while Bill was at work. Grinding, measuring, drying, blending, following Granny May's instructions like scripture. When the mixture finally reached the color of cinnamon, fine as flour, my hands shook. I stored it inside an empty pill bottle labeled iron supplements, hid it under the bathroom sink, behind a box of feminine products Bill would never touch. But having the powder and using it were different things. Nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if God would forgive me, wondering if I was any better than Bill if I crossed this line, wondering if the fear would keep me frozen forever. Then one morning, as I sat at the kitchen table with coffee gone cold in my hands, I knew no one was coming to save me, not the pastor, not the doctor, not my family. If I wanted to live, truly live, I would have to save myself. And the powder was my only way out. Thursday morning started like any other morning, which almost felt cruel considering what I intended to do. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and Bill was still snoring beside me, his breath heavy and uneven. It struck me how peaceful he looked in sleep, how normal. If someone walked in at that moment, they'd see a husband and wife beginning another day of ordinary life, not a woman preparing to reclaim hers. I dressed quietly in the bathroom, choosing a blue dress Bill always liked. I didn't do it for him. I did it for me. I needed to feel steady, composed, invisible, someone who could slip through the morning without raising suspicion. I put on makeup carefully, covering the fading bruise along my cheekbone. It had turned that sickly yellow color bruises get right before they vanish. Downstairs, I moved through the kitchen on autopilot, starting the coffee pot, mixing pancake batter, setting the table the way Bill preferred. Every motion repeated from years of routine, but beneath it all, my heart beat like a drum. The powder was in my apron pocket. I felt it every time I moved. The coffee maker gurgled, releasing that familiar smell, bitterness and warmth intertwined. I took Bill's favorite mug off the shelf, the one that said, "World's Greatest Dad." The irony almost made me laugh. Instead, I placed it gently on the table and poured his first cup. Black, 2 sugars, just how he liked it. I flipped the pancakes one by one, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. I'd practiced this moment in my head over and over. No hesitation, no trembling, no second guessing. The stairs creaked. Bill was up. I forced myself to breathe normally. Pancake, flip, orange juice, pour. Act like everything is fine. "Morning," he grunted, walking into the kitchen in his robe, eyes half open. "Good morning," I said lightly. "Sleep well?" He didn't answer, just took his coffee and gulped half of it in one swallow before opening the morning newspaper. Routine, predictable. He had no idea the world was shifting beneath him. I put the plate of pancakes in front of him, 3, butter melting exactly the way he liked. While his attention stayed on the sports section, I turned to the stove and prepared the second cup. My hands didn't shake, not even a little. I slipped the powder into the mug. The fine brown dust swirled in the blackness before dissolving. I stirred twice clockwise, once counterclockwise, the way Granny May had written, so it blends evenly. I added 2 sugars and walked it to the table, setting it beside him as casually as setting down a salt shaker. "More coffee?" I asked. He nodded, still focused on the newspaper. He didn't look at me. He almost never did anymore. I washed dishes at the sink, watching the clock out of the corner of my eye. According to Granny May, it would take 20 minutes to work. 15 minutes in, I noticed Bill blinking hard, squinting at the print. "Paper's blurry," he muttered. My eyes must be tired. My breath caught, but I kept drying plates as though nothing was happening. A minute later, he yawned wide, sudden, heavy. "Didn't sleep good," he said, voice thick. "Feel strange. Maybe you're coming down with something," I said, letting just enough concern into my voice to seem believable. He pushed back his chair and stood slowly, unsteady on his feet. "Think I'll sit in my chair a while." He shuffled into the living room, and moments later, I heard the recliner creak as he sank into it, a rustle of the newspaper, then a soft thump. The paper fell from his hands. I waited 5 minutes, longest 5 minutes of my life. My heart beat so loud I thought I could hear it over the ticking clock. Finally, I walked into the living room. Bill's head was tilted to one side, mouth slightly open. His breathing was deep, steady, almost rhythmic. I waved my hand in front of his face. "Nothing." "Bill?" I said softly. Silence. I pressed 2 fingers to his wrist, his pulse strong and slow. Exactly as promised. Deep sleep. Not death, not harm, just silence, just stillness. For the first time in decades, the man who controlled every breath I took was powerless. I can't describe the feeling. It wasn't triumph, Not joy, not even relief at first. It was stillness. Like I'd stepped into a world where everything had paused and I could finally move without being watched. He could not hurt me, not for hours, not today. I stuck to my plan. First, I called the factory. Bill won't be in today, I told the receptionist. He's come down with something. Next, I went to the linen closet and pulled out the small bag. I'd packed clothes, toiletries, important papers, the key Aunt Judith had given me. Then I walked upstairs to Bill's dresser, opened his wallet, and took $100 from the cash he kept. I left the remaining 20, not out of kindness, but because I wanted him confused, not enraged when he woke up. Then I went to the den, opened the desk drawer Bill always told me not to touch, and found the checkbook. His signature was one I'd practiced forging for decades on permission slips, school forms, Christmas cards. I wrote a check to myself for $2,000, half of what was in the joint account. It wasn't stealing. It was surviving. Then I tucked that check into my purse and walked toward the door. Before leaving, I stopped in the living room and looked at Bill one more time. He looked small, smaller than I'd ever seen him. I covered him with a blanket not out of love, but to hide him from any neighbor who might glance through the window. I didn't need questions. Then I opened the door and stepped outside. The morning air hit me like a baptism. Cool, fresh, real. I walked 3 blocks to the bus stop. I didn't look back. I forced myself not to. Every step was a lifetime of fear, loosening its grip on my spine. Mrs. Peterson was outside watering her roses. "Off to the store, Martha?" she called. "Just running errands," I said, steady as a stone. The number 7 bus arrived on time. When I sat down near the back, clutching my purse, something inside me finally exhaled. Deep, long, trembling, like I'd been underwater for 30 years and had just broken the surface. The first stop was the bank. My hands shook slightly as I handed the check to the young teller. "I'd like to cash this, please," she hesitated. $2,000 is a lot. Do you want smaller bills?" "Yes," I said. "20s, please." She walked to the manager's office, whispered something. My heartbeat pounded in my throat. But then, Mr. Garvey stepped out, smiling politely, clueless as ever. "Replacing a furnace, Martha?" he asked pleasantly. I blinked. "That's right. The old one's dying. Cash is smart these days," he said. "Contractors give discounts." Minutes later, I walked out of the bank with an envelope of crisp bills and my purse heavier with possibility. From there, I went straight to the Greyhound station. Bought a one-way ticket to Atlanta, departure at 2 p.m. Enough time for one more thing. I called Jimmy at his army base. And for the first time in his life, my son heard freedom in my voice. When the bus pulled away from Millfield, I didn't cry. I thought I might. I thought leaving the place where I'd spent my whole adulthood, where I'd raised my children, tended my garden, lived through joy and terror in equal measure, would tear something inside me, but instead, all I felt was a strange lightness. Like a rope that had been pulling tight around my chest for decades had finally snapped. I watched the familiar fields roll by, the old water tower shrinking in the distance. I kept waiting for panic to hit, for guilt to sneak up my spine, for fear to take hold. But all I felt was quiet, and that quiet felt like a miracle. The bus rocked gently, lulling me into the first peaceful sleep I'd had in years. When I woke, the sun was lower in the sky, and my hands were clenched around my purse like it was a lifeline. In a way, it was. Inside that purse was everything that kept me alive now. Money, the key to Granny May's emergency fund, Helen's sister's phone number, and the address of a future I hadn't dared to imagine before. I reached Atlanta at 9 p.m. Doris was waiting for me at the station, a plump woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense voice that reminded me of Helen. She hugged me like she'd known me forever. "You're safe now," she said softly. "Let's get you home." Those words almost undid me. Her apartment was small but bright, filled with plants and soft lamps. She showed me the spare bedroom, the bed neatly made, a vase of daisies on the nightstand. "I've been expecting you," she said. "Women like us always arrive sooner or later." That night, I lay in the clean sheets, staring at the ceiling. I should have felt relief. I did. But under the relief was something else, fear. A deep, trembling fear that Bill would find me, that he'd break through the door, that he'd drag me back. Fear doesn't vanish just because you've left the place where it grew. But I told myself, he is asleep. He is confused. He is powerless for the first time in his life. And I am gone. The next morning, Doris left for her hospital shift, and I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. The silence felt strange. No footsteps, no shuffling newspaper, no orders barked from the doorway. I didn't know what to do with myself. Helen called at noon. He woke up, she said. He's been asking around. The whole town knows something's wrong. My breath hitched. Is he angry? Oh, Martha, she sighed. He is furious, but he's also scared. Your letter shook him. Good, I thought. Let him feel 1 ounce of what I felt for 30 years. The next few days were a blur of fear and purpose. Doris didn't push me, but she nudged gently in all the right directions. I found a job at a small diner, nothing glamorous, just refilling coffee cups and wiping down tables. But it gave me something I hadn't had in decades. My own income, my own independence. At the Social Security office, the clerk explained I could receive benefits after filing for divorce. That word divorce felt heavy, final, but also strangely liberating, like shackles breaking. 3 weeks into my new life, I answered the phone one afternoon. Mama? Jimmy's voice. Yes, honey? He came to the base. Ice slid through my veins. Did he hurt you? No, Jimmy said. He was drunk, angry, said you drugged him, said you stole from him. I told him if he ever came near my barracks again, the MPs would handle him. I closed my eyes. I'm sorry, sweetheart. Don't be, Jimmy said firmly. I'm proud of you. About damn time you left him. That was the first moment I realized my children hadn't just survived their father, they'd seen through him long before I admitted the truth. But fear has a long reach. 2 weeks later, during my shift at the diner, I saw a familiar truck pull into the parking lot. My hands went cold. I ducked behind the swinging kitchen door as the bell over the entrance jingled. Mrs. Patel, the owner, a small woman with sharp eyes and a sharper backbone, walked straight to the front. Sir, she said, this is private property. You need to leave. I'm looking for my wife, Bill growled. Don't lie to me. She's not here, Mrs. Patel said. And I'm calling the police if you take one more step. For a moment, I thought he'd push past her, but he didn't. He snarled something under his breath and stormed out, the door slamming so hard it shook the windows. I collapsed on the kitchen floor, shaking. Mrs. Patel knelt beside me. You're safe, she said. As long as you're under my roof, no man is going to lay a hand on you. Another woman saving me. Another invisible chain snapping. I didn't wait for a second visit. Doris helped me pack, and by the next morning, I was on a bus to Savannah. A new city, a new name, my maiden name, Wilson, a new job, and a lawyer who specialized in helping women like me. Bill contested the divorce? Of course. Claimed I was mentally unstable, that I'd abandoned him, that I'd stolen his money. My lawyer presented x-rays, medical records, affidavits from Jimmy and Tommy, and copies of the diary entries I'd kept over the years. The judge awarded me half of everything, including the house. Bill had to take out a mortgage just to buy out my share. For the first time in our marriage, I had leverage, and he had none. Months passed. My hands stopped shaking. I learned to sleep without listening for footsteps. I went to church again. I stopped apologizing when someone bumped into me. I learned how to breathe deeply, laugh loudly, and exist without fear. And then, 2 years later, the phone rang. Jimmy again. Mama, he said gently. Dad's sick, really sick, stage 4 lung cancer. I sank onto the couch. I'm sorry to hear that, I whispered. And I meant it, in a way I didn't expect. He's asking for you, Jimmy said. He wants to apologize. My body tightened, old fear rising like smoke. I don't know if I can, I whispered. Then don't, he said. You don't owe him anything. But that week, I prayed, talked to Doris, talked to my pastor, talked to Helen, and realized something. Seeing him might not be for him. It might be for me. So I said, I'll come. But I'm not staying in that house, and one of you boys stays with me. 2 days later, I walked back into Millfield for the first time in almost 2 years. And the man who once filled every doorway with terror was now a trembling shadow in a recliner. He looked up at me with watery eyes. Martha, he whispered, you came, and for the first time in decades, I felt nothing, not fear, not anger, just absence. A silence where old pain used to live. He apologized, truly apologized. No excuses, No blaming, just frail honesty from a dying man. I listened, not for him, for myself. And when I left that day, I realized something powerful. I had survived him, and I was stronger than he had ever been. I stayed in Millfield longer than I planned, 2 weeks instead of 2 days. Not because I wanted to be near Bill, but because my children needed me. Carol, especially. She had been trying to take care of him alone between her job, her kids, and her own troubled marriage. Seeing her exhaustion, her strained smile, reminded me too clearly of myself in my 30s. I couldn't solve her life for her, but I could stand beside her through this chapter. Some mornings, when I came by the house, Bill was lucid enough to talk. Not about the violence, not about the broken bones or slammed doors. He talked about the early days, the picnic, the blue sundress, the crib he built for Jimmy. He drifted in and out of time like a man untethered from his own life. One afternoon, I adjusted his blanket and he murmured, "You were beautiful in that dress, at the church picnic. Remember?" "I remember," I said softly. It felt like speaking to a ghost that still clung to a memory of when things were pure and hopeful, before the rot set in. He died on a Tuesday morning in November, a cold, bright morning with frost on the windows. I was there, sitting beside Carol. Jimmy held his father's hand. Tommy rushed in 20 minutes too late, tears streaking down his face even though he'd sworn he wouldn't cry for a man who hurt us. Bill's last words were a whisper meant for me. "Thank you for coming back." I don't know if it was gratitude, apology, or simply fear of dying alone. I'll never know. Some answers die with the person who held them. The funeral was small. I stood graveside and felt nothing. Not anger, not relief, not grief. Just a quiet settling inside me, like dust after a long storm. His sister hugged me tightly afterward and whispered, "You should have used that powder years ago." If only she knew. After the funeral, the house had to be sorted. Memories stuffed in drawers, ghosts in every hallway. The kids argued about selling it. Carol didn't want to let go, clinging to the idea of a family home. But Jimmy said what I was thinking. It's just a house. Walls don't hold family together. People do, or they don't. In the end, we sold it. The market was good. The money was split 4 ways, 1 share for each child and 1 for me. I tried refusing my share, but Jimmy pressed my hands around the check. "Use it, Mom. Build the life you deserve." I didn't argue. Before leaving Millfield again, I visited Helen's bookstore one last time. She hugged me so tightly I almost broke. We drank tea in her little back office, the same place where she'd once gently opened the door to my truth. "So," she said, "back to Savannah?" I shook my head. "No. Too many memories, too many roots pointing backward. Where will you go?" "I always wanted to live near the ocean," I said. "Somewhere peaceful, somewhere warm." "Florida?" she suggested. I smiled. Florida. It felt right. A new beginning at the edge of the water. I returned to Savannah long enough to pack my few belongings, give notice at the diner, and say goodbye to the quiet life that had held me safely while I learned to be myself again. 2 weeks later, I stepped off a bus in St. Petersburg, Florida. The air was soft and salty, the sky a wide watercolor of pink and gold. I rented a small apartment, 3 blocks from the beach, nothing grand, but bright, warm, full of sunlight and possibility. With the money from the house sale, $37,000, I furnished it modestly. A second-hand sofa, a little dining table, a balcony chair where I could watch the sunset every evening. For the first time in decades, I felt ownership, not just of a space, but of myself. I found a part-time job at the local library, shelving books, helping children find storybooks, running the Thursday story hour. It wasn't work I needed financially. It was work that made me feel human, useful, connected. The librarian, a gentleman named Arthur, told me once, "You have a calming presence. The children love you." Calm. It still felt strange to be described that way. For so long, my life had been anything but calm. Years passed, 15 of them, slipping by like pages turning themselves. I built a little circle of friends. Widows, divorcees, retired teachers, women who'd also rebuilt their lives after storms. We played cards on Thursdays. We went to early bird specials at seafood places along the beach. We took water aerobics classes and laughed when our hips cracked. My children built their own lives too. Jimmy retired from the Army as a master sergeant and moved just an hour away. He visits often, sometimes with his wife, sometimes with his 2 teenagers who call me grandma like it's one word. Tommy became a psychologist specializing in trauma. One day, on my balcony, he told me, because of what I saw growing up, I wanted to help people heal. He lives in California with his partner David. They're talking about adopting. I visit every summer. They visit every Christmas. Carol's story was harder. She stayed in her marriage long after she should have left my shadow, repeating my choices, my silences. I could see the signs, the careful makeup, the strained voice, the excuses. I never pushed her, never judged her, just told her, again and again, my door is open. 5 years ago, she arrived at that door, suitcases in hand, a black eye blooming across her cheek. I remembered what you did, she whispered as we sat together on my balcony, and I wanted to be brave like you. She lives in Tampa now, teaches 2nd grade. She has a gentleman friend who treats her gently, like she's learning what tenderness feels like for the first time. Some people ask if I ever dated again, if I ever remarried. The truth is, a few men showed interest, widowers from church, a retired English teacher from the library, even my downstairs neighbor after his wife passed. I enjoyed their company, shared dinners, stories, laughter. But marriage? No. Not because I'm bitter, not because I'm scared, but because I'm peaceful. After living decades walking on eggshells, peace is the richest luxury I know. Sometimes, when I'm at the grocery store or the library, I'll catch the eye of a woman who looks too small inside her own body, who apologizes too quickly, who checks her watch with fear flickering behind her eyes. I recognize her instantly. I was her. And in small ways, I try to leave breadcrumbs the way others left them for me. Pamphlets on a table, hotline numbers slipped into books, a quiet, steady look that says, "You're not alone. I see you." And now, at 73, I stand on my balcony every evening, watching the ocean breathe in and out like the world's oldest lullaby. I close my eyes, let the salt air wash over me, feel the warmth on my face, and think, this is what peace feels like. This is what freedom tastes like. People sometimes ask if I regret what I did that morning. I slipped the powder into Bill's coffee. I always give the same answer. I'm not proud of it, but I don't regret it. Because without that powder, I might still be in that house. Or I might be 6 feet under, buried beside a man who promised to love me, but only ever loved owning me. And if my story reaches even one woman, if it helps one person realize they deserve better, then telling it has been worth every painful memory it stirred. My name is Martha Johnson. For 30 years, I lived in fear. For the past 15, I have lived in freedom. And you, where are you listening from? How is your life going? Did my story mean something to you? If it did, let me know in the comments below. With love and respect, always.